Snapshot. Think for a moment, what evidence of learning do you collect in math? The most common being a test. Think for a few moments, what kind of evidence of learning could you collect in math? Well, let's take a look here. What evidence of learning can we collect in math? Well, the most common one that I use in my class, or that I've used, is tests. Pre-test, mid-test, post-test. This was fine, this was okay, but it really was one small piece of evidence, a similar piece of evidence. If I really want to expand and see what kids know, I really needed to expand. So here's what I did. Or what you could do is multiple guess. We could give multiple choice tests, fill in the blank, problem-based ideas, portfolios. We can ask kids to hand in growth portfolios, which show a range of their work, growth of their work, or best evidence portfolios, which is the best learning they can show. We can ask kids to do math journals and do reflective pieces there and show lots of different strategies. We can give kids unit problems and have them work in pairs or groups or alone. We can give kids self-assessment templates and ask them to reflect on their learning. We can ask students to create problems and solutions to see where they're at. That's very significant in terms of seeing students' understanding. We can ask kids to show their math learning with videos or comics or stories or PowerPoint presentations in the computer lab and so on. There's just so many different ways we can do it. Once we start brainstorming, we can see that collecting evidence from students is much more than just giving them tests. Let's take a look at this piece of evidence. In this piece of evidence that this teacher gathered, the students were to look at fractions and decimals and to match them up. So for example, number 1, we see 3/10 of the boxes are colored in. We see 3/10 as a fraction and 3/10 as a decimal. The student got this all right, so I guess we can assume from this that they have a full understanding of fractions and decimals and how they match, right? Well, perhaps not. I talked to the teacher about this, and the teacher told me that, in fact, what this student had done, because she thought that the student had understood it, what the student had done is merely followed a pattern, but not a pattern to deepen conceptual understanding, but a pattern to get these answers right. Now that's fascinating to me. And so here's what they did. They saw a 3 and a line and a 10, and so they colored in 3 boxes. And then they put O.3. Moved on to the second one, they saw an 8, so they colored in 8 boxes, and then did an O.8, and so on, without any understanding at the end of this exercise about fractions or about decimals. So the kind of evidence that we collect from kids is vital. If they get it all right, does that mean they have a full, complete understanding? If they get them all wrong, conversely, does it mean they have no understanding at all? It depends on what we give the kids and what we collect. I'd like you to count the empty beehive cells in here for a second. Okay, if you could turn to page 43 in the booklet, How Do I Mark That? You'll see how I've worked on this with the class. There are little clips from videos on page 43 that show me working with kids and setting up a rubric based on this example. I asked the kids to start with, I said, how many empty beehive cells can you count? And kids counted in very many ways. Now this looks like a very simple activity, and it is, but it can generate lots of different strategies on how the kids count. Of course, some kids will count by 1. We want to move them past that. With larger grids, counting at 1 wouldn't be very efficient. So how are kids grouping things? Okay, cool activity. Kids had fun. They talked about it. They came up with a number of different strategies. But now the question is, how do we assess it? What I want to show you on page 43 and onwards in my book, How Do I Mark That, is how you can take a simple activity and make it very meaningful in terms of assessment. Let's move on, and I'm going to show you the actual template that we came up with. What I did was I divided kids, and it's all explained after page 43, on page 43. What I did was I asked a group of kids to talk about what accuracy means. I asked another group to talk about what strategies mean in math. And I asked a third group to talk about what representation means in math, showing your learning. The kids brainstormed lots of ways. I had an overhead, a blank overhead, and as we came together to talk about what the descriptors were, the kids mentioned it, and I, as facilitator, as teacher, jotted them down and the kids copied what I'd written. Let me stop here and say this. By no means am I saying we need to do this for every assignment. 90% of the time I would have these things already written and I would hand them out to the kids. Every so often I'd leave one of these areas blank and I might have 2 of them, and then the kids would add a 3rd piece of criteria. Every once in a while, in a rare while, on a blue moon, I would go do this with the kids. I'd have them generate the descriptors and we would come together and write them down on this paper. Let's take a close look at the top of this. And you can follow along if you'd like. Some examples on page 45 and following. You can see here that at the top we have the rubric, the outcome, which is I am learning to. And in this case it was solve problems using mental math and using appropriate strategies, explaining how I solved it. Now this is generally an outcome from the new IRPs, tweaked and reworded somewhat, but I wanted kids to use mental math and strategies, which is a very vital part of the new WNCP. And then I told them, like I said, the criteria would be accurate, strategies, and representation. We came together, we generated these descriptors, which you can see for accurate, it says I have the correct answer, you can't find any mistakes. We need to put a sentence with an answer and so on. Okay? Now, we'll see too that underneath it's on a 4-point scale, much like what the ministry says. I kind of tweaked the language a bit. I called exceeding true with a twist, fully meeting true, minimally meeting or approaching expectations, mostly true, and not yet meeting, I said not true. At the bottom here we have a 1, 2, 3, and 4. Because each one's out of 4, it's out of 12 because 4 plus 4 plus 4 equals 12, and then we worked it out that way. Don't worry, I'm going to go through this step by step, and let's get started here. Wow, when I look at this, I just think to when I used to mark things with the mark book where I had names down the side and all the assignments across the top. It was really overwhelming. And the 3 weekends before the report card was due, I was just scrambling trying to compile all these letter grades and percentages and things out of 35 and things out of 50, and some of it was on a 1 to 5 scale, and some of it was out of 100, and some of it was letter grades, and just overwhelming. On top of that, some of it was homework. Do I weigh that the same? Tests, posters, responses from kids, letters, essays, labs, pop quizzes, and it went on from there. Where do I go from here? Well, the thing I started doing was beginning with the end in mind. And so I had pages and pages and pages of class lists with assignments across the top. And I thought, let's get rid of that and start from scratch. And that's exactly what I did. And that's what this whole book's about. I wanted something that could be easy, quick, and fun. All right, it's never really fun. First thing I did was I looked in the IRPs and I found that a 11-step program. I added an extra step, making it 12 steps. We'll get into that in a moment. But basically the first few steps talk about identifying objectives and setting criteria with kids. You know, making the learning visible, making it explicit, not keeping it hidden or secret. Steps 4, 5, and 6 talk about planning the activities, showing kids different levels of performance, and getting them going on that. Then, using the marking guides in step 8 to assign. Step 9, reviewing the assessment data, evaluating each student's level of performance according to the criteria that we talked about. And 10 and 11 talk about reporting those results. Step 12, I added that one. Start with step 1 all over again. Because really, this isn't linear. We don't move from step 5 to step 7 in a nice way. Sometimes we go back to step 5 and redo step 6 and so on. I like to also think of it as linear in format. Well, how do